It is quite clear from all of the Jewish traditional and classical sources that the belief in Moshiach, the belief in the Messiah, not just the Messianic age, but that it will be ushered in by a human Jewish leader, is a fundamental part of Judaism. It's mentioned in the Torah, it's mentioned in all of our classical writings, and Maimonides goes as far as listing it among the 13 principles of faith. That means there are 13 things that Judaism hinges on. If we would remove them, it would be like removing a foundation of a building and the whole building will collapse. The whole structure of Judaism rests on those 13 beliefs, which include the belief in God, that there's one God, that God is not physical, that the Torah was given to us by God, and the reward and punishment. And also, the 12th principle is the belief that Mashiach will come to take us out of exile. Now, in order for it to be a fundamental belief, it can't just be a belief among all the other beliefs in Judaism that are important because they're in the Torah, but it's fundamental. As I just said, if you took away this foundation of Judaism, Judaism would collapse. And the question that we dealt with in the last class was, why is it so fundamental? Why can't one just believe in God, that God gave us the Torah, and that God holds us accountable, basis of all of the other preceding 11 principles of faith? Why isn't that enough? Why do we have to believe in a messianic age ushered in by Mashiach? So in the past class, we discussed several explanations. I'm not going to go through all of them, just very briefly. There is one explanation of the Abarbanel, the 15th century sage and diplomat and statesman, who explains that if not for the Messianic age, God's very sense of justice, of righteousness, is called into question. Look at all the suffering in the world. Look at all the good people who suffer and the bad people who prosper, which is a question that has been asked by Moses, and every great person and every not so great person has asked, why is there so much pain and suffering in this world? Well, the Messianic age will right what we perceive as wrongs, and those who are good will be rewarded, and therefore the questions that we have about God's sense of righteousness and justice and fairness and God's very existence, which is called into question by so many people, will be answered. So that's fundamental, because without understanding God's justice, then our belief in God is deficient, and therefore Messianic age is fundamental. Then we explained the halachic, the legalistic approach to this, that the Rabbi explains is really taken from Maimonides' writings himself, and that is that the Torah, which comprises 613 commandments, is incomplete now because we can't observe most of those commandments, because in order to observe them, we have to have the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple. And the Holy Temple doesn't exist until Mashiach will come and he will rebuild the temple. But meanwhile, hundreds of commandments are inoperable. They're not capable of being implemented. Not only that, but because we're living in exile, the conditions of exile make it difficult to observe many of the commandments. They put a lot of different pitfalls in our way. Even our study of Torah is compromised. We don't have a peace of mind to be able to put our minds totally into the study of Torah. In short, Torah is incomplete. Torah is deficient, you could say, because of the conditions that exist in exile. The Torah itself is not deficient. It's the ability for Torah to be part of our lives and to be implemented that is deficient. And therefore, the very existence of Torah as a way of life is called into question, is limited, and therefore we need Moshiach to change that, to reverse that, by rebuilding the temple, bringing all the Jews back to Israel, which will make all of the 613 commandments relevant to our very lives and bring us to a state of peace and tranquility, so we'll be able to study Torah on all different levels, and that will make Torah complete. I'd like to share two other explanations that explain why the belief in Mashiach is considered a fundamental belief. The first one is also given by the Rabbi, and it's an extension of the second one that I just mentioned, the integrity of Torah. but it's a little deeper than the first one. The first explanation that I gave you was that there are many commandments in the Torah that we can't fulfill. So the quantity of Torah commandments is smaller in terms of our ability to observe them. And also the quality with which we study Torah and we observe the mitzvot are limited, are compromised. But there's a little deeper explanation about the integrity of Torah. You see, we're living in a world, and when we look around, things that we see with our eyes and hear with our ears and all the other senses is what we call reality. We're living in an age of virtual reality, so it's not always clear what is reality. But the truth of the matter is, true reality is not what our senses pick up, but it's what is in the Torah. Torah is the very blueprint of creation. The Zohar, the principal work of Kabbalah, and the Midrash both tell us that when God created the world, istakel be'araita, he looked into the Torah and he created the world. That means the world's existence depends on Torah. The world doesn't have an independent existence. It's the Torah that is the blueprint of creation. You see, when we look at Torah, Torah can be understood on three levels in terms of what Torah really is. The most basic level, Torah comes from a word that means guidance, direction. Torah teaches us how to live our lives. It's a moral teaching that teaches us what is right and what is wrong. And for that reason, Torah is the most essential thing that we have, because without Torah, we wouldn't know how to live our lives. But there are two other dimensions of Torah. One dimension of Torah is that Torah in its essence, in its source, is beyond this world. The world has no relevance relative to Torah. Torah is referred to as God's plaything, his delight. That when we engage in the study of Torah, we are absorbing divine delight that goes way beyond anything that we could experience within the physical world, within the world the way we relate to it through our five senses. That's the higher level of Torah, Torah as God's plaything, as it were. Then you have Torah as the blueprint of creation. That means Torah relates to creation, but it's not just something that is introduced into creation, which is the other dimension of Torah. Torah is guidance. It is responsible for creation, and it is the true reality. What that means is that there cannot possibly be a real conflict between Torah and what we perceive of as reality. Because if it is a contradiction, the contradiction proves that what we perceive as reality is not reality. And it's easy for us to understand now with virtual reality that things that look like that they are real could actually not be real. So just because our senses think that this is real, it's only real if it's in the Torah. If it's not in the Torah, if it's not somewhere represented by the Torah, it's not part of reality. But we don't see it that way today. We don't see how Torah is the master of creation, and that if the Torah would say that it's day and it's at night, we would have to say, well, our perception is wrong. It is really day. That way of looking at reality through the prism of Torah is something that we don't experience today. That will become real, and that will become fully manifested in the Messianic age. So why is it a fundamental belief of Judaism? Because it's fundamental for us to understand that Torah is not subordinate to the world of reality. It didn't superimpose itself on reality. It is reality. And if we want to get in touch with reality, we have to see it through the prism of Torah, which is not easy living in the world in pre-Messianic times. But then there's the final explanation, and that is the one based on Hasidic thought, which begins with the very beginning. Why did God create this world? The truth of the matter is, there is no explanation that we could fathom. So rather than asking why he created the world, the question should be is, what did God have in mind when he created the world? What was his plan? What was his objective? So the Talmud says there are three opinions, and they're not mutually exclusive opinions, as we'll see. One opinion says that the world was created for Moses. One says it was created for David, King David. And the third opinion says it was created for Moshiach. Now we can understand why the world was created for Moses. Moses personified Torah. Moses is the one who delivered the Torah to us, and therefore he's identified with Torah. Without the Torah, there's no world. There's no purpose in having a world if there would not be a Torah introduced into this world. That makes sense. The world was created for David. King David is known for his psalms, for his prayer, for his exquisite ability to express the deepest emotions. The world can't exist without human beings expressing the heartfelt emotions and desire to get closer to God. King David is also the one who unified the Jewish people, who established the nationhood of the Jewish people when he became the monarch in Israel. We can understand why the world was created for David, because without David, we would not have a Jewish nation the way we know of the Jewish nation, and therefore we would not be able to implement the Torah. But why does the Talmud say that the world was created for Moshiach? And the answer is that when God created the world, he had a master plan. The master plan is the Torah, of course. What is the goal of the Torah? To make this world, which is a lowly world, and I'll soon explain what I mean by lowly world, to make this world a dwelling place for God. That's a quote from the Midrash, that God desired a dwelling place in the lowliest of realms. What do we mean by lowliest? In terms of God, in terms of spirituality, our world is the very lowest, because there are spiritual worlds, spiritual dimensions. And of all the worlds that can possibly exist, ours is the lowest. Why? Because our world is not just a materialistic world, but it's a world in which truth is obscured. The world does not readily allow us to see the divine imprimatur. It doesn't let us see God who is creating the world at all times. We look at the world, and it's even possible for people to deny God's existence or to defy that which God wants us to do, because we're living in a world that is totally concealed from the reality of God's presence. In fact, the word for world in Hebrew, olam, comes from a root that means concealment, that God created a concealed world. Why would he do that? Why would he create a world that conceals his very presence? And the answer is because he wants us to reverse that. He wants us to invite God back into this world, so to speak. He wants us to make this world a hospitable place for God. And how does that happen? So God created humanity. Human beings are capable of doing good. Now, if human beings were forced to do good, there would be no point in creating a world in which he wants it to be concealed, his presence, and then he forces everyone to recognize God. He could have created the world in the first place where everyone recognized God. So we have to have a human being that has free choice, and when a human being chooses right from wrong, good from evil, that reintroduces God into this world. And then God forms a nation, the Jewish people, to whom he entrusts the Torah, which is the master plan. And they are responsible for implementing God's presence into this world by way of the study of Torah, which illuminates our path, and the observance of the mitzvot, the commandments, which involve physical objects. And every time we do a mitzvah, we're introducing the divine into the physical world. So that in the aggregate, through all of the mitzvahs, all of the commandments that we fulfilled from the beginning of time until today, they accumulate and they refashion the world, that the world becomes receptive and hospitable to God. And when we reach critical mass, that is the Messianic age. So what is the purpose of the Messianic age? The Messianic age is the fulfillment of God's very plan for creation of the world. If not for the Messianic age, which means that God's plan would never be fully realized, would never come to fruition, then that would mean that God plans and his plans fizzle out. That would be very much a repudiation of everything we know about God, that God is perfect and God's plan must be fulfilled, must endure. And that's why the Talmud says that the world was created for Moshiach, because without Moshiach, God's very plan would not be realized. And that really ties in with the other opinions that say the world was created for Moses. Because where did the world get the master plan to implement, to allow the world to reach its goal? That was through Moses. Where did the world get its first country that was united under one monarch that enabled them to build a temple, in which place the plan that God had was not just a theoretical plan, but was being implemented because you now had a country, a viable country? That started with King David and King Solomon, who built the temple, and it will be completed with the coming of the Moshiach. And to believe in that is to believe in the most fundamental aspect of Judaism, that God has a plan and has a purpose, and that we are the instruments through which God fulfills his purpose. Now, there are differences between the way humanity at large prepares the world for the Messianic age and the Jewish people. But that's a topic for another time, to go into the differences between the different roles and missions of different segments of humanity. But the common denominator is that every human being in this world was put here to pave the way for the Messianic age. And that is what we aspire to, and we constantly pray for its fulfillment, because its fulfillment is not just something that will be good for us, it's the fulfillment of God's very plan. And there could be nothing greater for a human being than to do that which God craves, to have a home within our world, within our homes, within our lives.